Hello everyone, welcome to another video. My name is Zach. We're going to continue from where we left off in a previous video where we created a conference website, a website where attendees, speakers, sponsors can visit and see information about the conference, browse the sessions, navigate around, see what's happening. However, we left off an important feature, and that feature was collecting event registration tickets. So today's video, we're going to build that functionality on top of the Raytha platform so we can collect tickets and integrate with Stripe payments. We're going to do this in .NET, so there's going to be a lot of C# code that we're going to talk about. So we're going to kind of flip back and forth. So put your technical hat on because it's going to be a very technical video, and we'll go from there.
All right, let's do a quick demo of what we want to build. I added a buy tickets item to the navigation bar here. We're going to click that. And here you can purchase a bunch of different tickets, not just for yourself, but for other people, because that's typical when you're doing an event registration for a conference. We're going to just put in some fake information here. And you can also select which ticket you're purchasing, because you may be selling different types of tickets at different prices. We're going to add another ticket. And choose another price. So we're selling one for $10, the workshop only, and the other at full event. We're going to click purchase tickets. This redirects us to Stripe, where we can fill out credit card information. But take note at the different products that were added. And actually, if we go back and we change one of these to workshop only, so now they're both the same type of ticket, and we click purchases again, then you're going to see that it's $20 in total at $10 each for quantities. So our platform has to be smart enough when we're interacting with Stripe to be able to handle those types of use cases. Now our Stripe right now, we're using the dev test mode, so we got to put in the developer credit card information. So none of this is real, obviously. So when you're working with Stripe, you need to make sure that you're in developer mode. There we go. Our purchase was successful. Let's check the back end of Raytha. And we see here I added a new content type called tickets, and it added the 2 tickets that were just purchased. And if we click edit here, we can see the name, email, test org, along with the ticket type. And this is hooked up to the payment intent that comes from Stripe, so we know which transaction this is linked to on the Stripe dashboard. So we can look that up if we need to, or maybe issue a refund. So this is already pretty great, pretty simple event registration functionality that we got working. I just want to take a moment. If we head back and go to the ticket purchasing again, we're collecting these fields, but you can collect any fields that you want beyond just these basic fields that I think people would typically expect. Because you can come into your content type that you're creating and you can add all the fields that you want. So long as you modify your form to collect those fields, you'll be able to save that data. Maybe you want to collect information about their lunch preferences, or do they have any special needs that they need to make the conference organizers aware of. So this gives us all the flexibility to add more fields that you want to collect. However, also be mindful that if you add more fields during event registration, it kind of adds a burden to the person filling out the form, and you may actually have some people drop off. All right, let's transition over to the code, and we'll walk through the architecture for this implementation. All right, we got Visual Studio open right now. It all gets kicked off here under Tickets Controller, which is pretty light. There isn't really much code here at all. So we have the buy action, and it checks to see if we set a cookie with the ticket details that we've already may have entered into the form. This is because if you go to get redirected to Stripe and then you cancel and you go back, you don't want to force the person to have to retype everything in. So we do set a cookie, and I think that's just a better user experience. But if no details were filled in, then just go ahead and output to the view, and we have a view called buy. So we'll just click that here under the right side, views, buy. And this is just the HTML for the form. It's standard Razor syntax. There's nothing interesting or unusual about this. We are using just vanilla JavaScript to handle the add another functionality, and that also wasn't too bad. I used ChatGPT to just help me write this, so it only took a couple minutes. Let's go back. Now, once we actually click purchase, that is when the real magic happens. So when someone clicks purchase tickets, it submits the form, and we then make a call to begin buyticket.command. So we're using CQRS here with the Raytha platform, and we should just follow best practices when it comes to CQRS. So we're going to pass in this object for the tickets that were submitted into this command. And then if it's successful, we're going to set that cookie, as I mentioned earlier, and then redirect the user to Stripe hosted checkout page. So let's dive into this command and see how that works. So now we're going to go down this rabbit hole. Okay, on the right side, we have our application layer. And I added another directory called tickets where we can put our commands. We have two commands, begin by ticket and complete by ticket. So let's start off with begin by ticket. And this takes in the object that's passed in from the controller. And we do some validation on it using the Fluent validation library to make sure that there's at least one ticket and the purchaser must have an account in order to actually buy a ticket. And just there's probably some validation I'm missing right now. Again, I only spent a day on this, so probably another 3-4 days of QA required. So pretty sure there's more validation that should be put onto the submission form. But then over here, we have the request handler. Okay, and the request handler, this is where things get really interesting. So we have the iPayment provider. An iPayment provider is simply an interface that's injected through dependency injection. And that is defined under common interfaces, iPayment provider. So I added this, and it just has two methods on here. Okay, string begin purchase tickets, and it takes in the user who made the purchase along with the tickets. And this ticket is defined in our entities. So we have a domain entity class added there as well. So under entities and ticket. So that's it. We just have a single ticket here. It's actually not on the database, and I'll come back to that later. But that is an entity. And we also have get tickets from session, which we'll tackle when we do the get complete. Now, iPayment provider is important because it's an interface that's injected. And why is this important? It's because, well, what happens if we want to switch away from Stripe in the future to something else? Or what happens if you want to be able to support multiple different payment providers, depending on the customer's needs? And so if we just implement and call against an interface, then that gives us some flexibility from an architecture standpoint. So we have the interface defined up here in the application layer, and then the actual implementation is done in the Raytha.infrastructure layer under the services directory. So I added a Stripe payment provider class that implements the iPayment provider. So if you wanted to modify this or provide support for a different payment provider, you can just add it under services, implement iPayment provider. You might have to do a little bit of extra work, but other than that, it might be done. So that's why you want to code to an interface. Just makes things simpler down the road. So this is the Stripe payment provider, which implements iPayment provider. And the begin purchase tickets creates a session create options, and we're passing in the customer email to pre-fill their email. We're getting a session line items, which is based on the tickets that we purchased in. And all that's doing is doing a group by to see how many of each ticket type has been purchased and then setting the quantity on that. So that's why I mentioned earlier in the little demo, if you have 2 tickets of the same type, it should just add that item with a quantity of 2 when you're actually checking out. So that's kind of a best practice. So it does the little kind of math here to determine the quantity and how many different products are being purchased. And it also sets the return URL, the purchase URL, if it's successful, as well as if it's canceled, okay? And that's attached to the relative URL builder. So we have a relative URL builder, which just helps us get URLs from the current application. And we're also attaching session ID. This is just Stripe's way of saying, hey, when the person is completed their checkout and is successful, we want to send them back to you with a session ID. Now, you could also not include this little line here and do the whole thing with webhooks, but I actually prefer this because it's easier to develop against. Otherwise, with webhooks, you might have to set up something like ngrok or another tool in order to ingest webhooks for development purposes. They say webhooks are more reliable. I actually find that a little debatable, although you could say that if it's being redirected, maybe someone's connection gets lost in the middle of checking out and getting redirected to your page. So I could see arguments on both sides, but I actually prefer this method, and that's what we're going with for ease of use today. Lastly, I'm taking the actual ticket data and I'm storing it in the metadata for the Stripe session. And it's going to actually be stored in Stripe itself as a key value pair, with the key being the email address of the person who has their ticket being purchased for, along with JSON serialized value of all the data that was provided. We're going to use this later when we go to complete a ticket purchase. At the bottom here, we're just pulling the Stripe secret key from our configuration, which is stored in our app settings or environment variables, and then we're returning the session URL, and that's how we get back the actual URL to redirect the user to. So we're gonna go back up to the top of the rabbit hole, at least one layer. And you see here, we're getting the session URL because that's what's being called. And then we're returning it to our controller, which is then redirecting the user to Stripe hosted checkout. All right, let's head back to the controller. And let's recap where we're at. So we just completed the entire workflow of the buy portion, where a person is going to click purchase tickets and then get redirected to Stripe hosted checkout page. It is at this point where they are now in Stripe's hands, filling out their credit card details on that Stripe hosted checkout page. And if it's successful, we get redirected to this page. And this is how Stripe knows to come to this endpoint due to that relative URL builder that I showed briefly earlier. And this is taking in that session ID so that we know what the session value is coming from Stripe. We then take that session ID and pass it to the other command that we had set up called completeByTicket.command. So actually, I'm just going to jump right in there. And we have a bit more code on this end because first we need to inject our database and also the payment provider. And this is the other function, the get tickets from session ID, that the other function that was defined on that interface. So let's go to the implementation for that. And all we're doing is getting the session by ID and pulling out the payment intent ID and the metadata that we JSON serialized earlier. And we're returning it as a tuple just for convenience. We probably could have created an object for that too if we wanted to. So let's go back up to where we just were. And now we got the result, which is that tuple of the payment intent ID and the tickets essentially that were JSON serialized. Now the rest of this code is all about storing those tickets as content items in the back end of the Raytha platform. So we're getting the ticket content type by its developer name. We just need some template to assign the tickets to. So we created an empty template so that there's nothing rendering if you go to the page, for example. Then we have tickets to add. So we're looping through the tickets that came back from the metadata of the Stripe session. We're deserializing it. We have the email address. We are creating a new ticket by giving it a content item ID. And then we're setting all the values based on the developer names that we defined when we created the content type in the Raytha platform. And that is how we store all those values, because these are the developer names, and now we can set those values here. And then we're just adding it into the platform with a standard ticket.add and just putting in some boilerplate, setting the publish content, the draft content, giving it a route. Some of the stuff is just boilerplate that we need to put in there just so that the system is happy. But beyond that, it's pretty basic, and we just save the items to the database. Now, one thing I do want to mention a little bit more, because it may not be obvious, is the ticket type. So when you're working with the Stripe API, you need to provide a price ID for the line items that you're going to charge for. So let's head back actually to the infrastructure Stripe payment provider. And I did kind of just hand wave the price here, which is the actual price ID. But where did this come from? So this comes from the products that you need to set up in the Stripe dashboard. So you need to set up, so the workshop and the full event are actual products I set up in Stripe, and I got a Stripe ID back for that. If we go to the buy HTML, I'm setting the value here, which if we define, go to definition, I just basically hard coded these values in for the different types of prices that we have. Now, this is linked up to the Raytha platform when you actually store the tickets into the database, because if we head back to the So here's the values here. But if we go back here and then click edit on one of these tickets, you see it's an actual drop down value. And the system is smart enough to match the two because of how we set up the actual fields in the platform for the ticket type. So you see it's a drop down type, and we click edit, and I put the values here under the developer name field to match what we did when we created the HTML form. So because these values match in Raytha as they do on the HTML form that we built, that makes it easy for us to just set the value when we're storing the data into the database. So that's going to do it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Go ahead and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. This was a kind of a real world case where we want to sell event registration tickets and integrate with the Stripe platform using kind of best practices for sizable .NET applications. So you get to see all the different components, the commands and queries, CQRS, using interfaces, the infrastructure, you have the entire controller layer. So we went through quite a bit here, and it could get complicated at times, but that's what development is all about. So we hope to see you in the next video. Have a great day.